Hello, and welcome once again to our British Cartographic Society Teatime Talk. My name is Chris Tributus. I am the coordinator for the Teatime Talks and today's chair. I want to welcome everyone to our first talk of 2022. Today's speaker is David Sherren, the map librarian at the University of Portsmouth and the British Cartographic Society Honorary Secretary. Today he'll be speaking on aMAZEing maps. And so without much further ado, I will pass you over to David, where he'll give us a talk on what will be quite amazing.
Thank you, Christopher. And hello, everyone. Thank you very much for joining this evening. It's great to see some familiar names on the list of participants. Right, so first of all, cast your minds back. I don't know how many of you recognise this particular this image. Well, I've based my opening slide on what became the highest grossing arcade game of the 1980s. Pac-Man was a maze action game, but I'm afraid this slide serves really no other purpose other than the fact that it's loosely maze based, and it's just an excuse for me to show off what could be done using the tools available in PowerPoint. But anyway, today I'm going to be talking about aMAZEing maps, or more specifically about mazes and how they have been depicted on Ordnance Survey maps. We're going to wind our way through a bit of maze history first. Then I'm going to talk a bit about a maze that is local, or was local to me, and which really inspired me to look further into mazes. And then we'll take a look at a few examples of mazes around Great Britain and look at how they have been shown on maps. First, just a bit more background about me. Thank you for the introduction, Christopher. So yes, I am the map librarian at the University of Portsmouth, where I've been since 1987, incredibly. I do have another role there, though. I variously get described as copyright librarian, copyright officer, or even perhaps rather optimistically, copyright guru. I'm active in the British Cartographic Society, and as Christopher said, I'm the secretary, and I've been in that role since 2016. Now, much as I love my maps, I get the real fun actually outside of work. So I've been percussionist with the Portsmouth Light Orchestra for several years, and also I've been a member of a local amateur theatrical society for about 36 years now. But let's move away quickly from that shocking image there. What I'm definitely not is a maze expert. So this little talk today really is just based upon some sort of very casual sort of research that I've made over the last year or two, looking into mazes. So I'm certainly not an expert. Okay, so I'll be talking about mazes and labyrinths. First of all, what is the difference? The two words are often used synonymously, but I like to make this distinction. So with a maze, you must have a choice in the pathway. So you enter your maze, you can turn left or right or go straight on, so you have choices to make. Whereas in a labyrinth just has one single convoluted path to the centre, so you can't deviate from that. There's just one way in, one way out. So that's kind of the difference between mazes and labyrinths. Now, the first labyrinths began to appear maybe a couple of thousand BC, carved on rock faces or scratched as graffiti or painted on pottery. And perhaps the best known reference to a labyrinth is the one in which King Minos imprisoned the legendary Minotaur, Knossos, on Crete. And here we see a coin showing that labyrinth, a design that appears largely without change around the Mediterranean Sea. And here's another example from a site near Tintagel in Cornwall. Now, these things can be very difficult to date. So is this example from the Bronze Age? So is it about 1500 BC? Or is it just perhaps a couple of hundred years old? It's very hard to tell, although I think experts think that the latter might well be the case in this Tintagel example. The The slaying of the Minotaur is just one feature of this particular painting, Theseus and the Minotaur, which is part of the collection in the Louvre. And it shows that typical labyrinth design that crops up again and again, but this time it's a masonry construction. The Minotaur clearly seems to be having quite a bad time in the middle there. I suspect that Theseus is simply venting his frustration at the fact that the labyrinth's pathways have been made too narrow for the human body. Or he's probably also thinking, why did Ariadne give me a ball of thread as a navigation aid when there is clearly only one way out of this thing? Here's another example of a labyrinth. In this case, this is from the Basilica at Saint-Quentin in northern France, and it's modelled on a similar one at nearby aMAZEing Cathedral. And once again, you see that same labyrinth pattern, this time in the form of floor tiles. So we've had masonry labyrinth, floor tiles, they can be made of stones. Hundreds of labyrinths formed with stones and boulders can be found throughout Sweden, Norway and Finland, and this is a particularly good example from Sweden. And turf labyrinths, often called turf mazes, were once widespread in Britain. Though only a few examples of these now remain. This is a particularly good example at Saffron Walden. Dates from, I think, about 1699. It's a big one. It measures about 40 metres from corner to corner. Now, only very recently, in fact, just in the last couple of weeks, I was reading at work James Cheshire and Oliver Uberti's book, The Information Capital. And I realised in the book that labyrinths also featured on the London Underground in the form of a major artwork by Mark Wallinger to celebrate the Tube's 150th anniversary. So there's a website devoted to it. I recommend having a look at that. And there's lots of examples of labyrinths on the Tube, which I found very interesting. The traditional hedge maze is for many the archetypal form. And it's found a home in gardens around the world. And here's an example of a hedge maze from a 16th century painting. Well, there are many examples of mazes throughout Britain. And indeed, this website, this is Labyrinths in Britain. It maps them out and it claims to show something like 500 examples of mazes around Britain. Although some of them do appear to be quite ephemeral. So, for example, there is a Moan labyrinth on the Warwick University campus listed on this site. Although, yeah, that sounds pretty ephemeral to me. I can't imagine that's a particularly permanent feature. And here is one of the latest. This is called Cerdroia, and it's being built at Colliford Lake on Bodmin Moor. And it's been built as a celebration of both this area's outstanding natural beauty, and it's celebrating the ancient tradition of Cornish hedge making. And I learnt about this particular thing while reading an article in The Guardian, and I was struck by this quote from the project director, who said that a maze is about getting lost, and this labyrinth will be about finding yourself. And this idea of being lost and then finding your way somehow struck a bit of a chord with me and our relationship with maps. Now, my very casual interest in mazes could perhaps be traced back to the time when I was walking with a friend of mine, and I think it was through the Southsea show on Southsea Common, here where I live. And we saw two men dressed in bright stripy blazers and sporting straw boaters. And my friend said to me, "I think that was Adrian Fisher," pointing to one of the gentlemen. Now, this house is a short distance from where I live in Southsea, and it has two interesting front gates. Now, if I just zoom in on the middle one here, you can see that it's a rather lovely thing in the form of a maze. This property is the former home of Adrian Fisher, and Adrian Fisher is regarded as possibly the greatest living maze designer. It states on his website that since 1979, Adrian and his company have designed and created over 700 full-size mazes in the grounds of sort of palaces, castles, stately homes, wildlife parks, amusement parks, universities, city centres, the list goes on and on. His work can be seen at some of the world's finest historic buildings and private gardens, including Alnwick Castle, Longleat House, and this particular example, which is from Blenheim Palace. Here's another of his hedge mazes. This is at Leeds Castle in Kent. Not just hedge mazes, but his maze of wooden panels at Egbeth's Otterspool Activity Centre looks particularly architectural and features changeable gates, so it allows you to change the layout regularly. So someone who's already visited the maze, they will find that they no longer will necessarily know the solution to the puzzle when they come back to it. Adrian Fisher Design Limited is also the world's leading mirror maze company. They've created something like 50 mirror mazes from around the world. And he's also designed the world's first cornfield maze. And I think he set something like 6 Guinness World Records for their creation. So it was in my mind that Southsea had this small connection with our great maze designer. And a few years ago, while I was working on our collection of Ordnance Survey 1 to 500 town plans of Portsmouth, that I came across this maze up in the top left of the sheet. It was obviously a good size. It's about 42 metres long, in fact. It's roughly equivalent in length to 2 cricket pitches. And being adjacent to Southsea Common, I thought at first that it was a public maze. Let's just zoom in a little bit. I see there's a little more detail there. But when I added the adjacent map sheet, I discovered that it wasn't a public maze. It was actually at the bottom of someone's garden. A very large garden, in fact, the garden of Bewley House, shown there on the left. Now, as an aside, I have a colleague in the library, her name's Paula Thompson, and she did a bit of research into this fascinating house, probably one of the largest properties built on Portsea Island, I should think, or private houses anyway. And she learnt that in 1886, the owner of the house decided to sell the land for property development. But he liked the house so much that he had it dismantled and moved brick by brick to another location in Southsea, which I find really incredible. So just to prove the point, I have to zoom in on the house. If I just rotate that map sheet, and then we can go and look at there it is depicted on a later map from 1954. So that's in a completely different part of town, but you can see from its outline it's exactly the same house. So you must have really, really liked that house to go to the trouble of moving it in that way. So having found this maze, it got me wondering, what other mazes I might be able to find on Ordnance Survey maps. Perhaps not surprisingly, the first one that came to mind was Hampton Court Maze, which I'm sure we've all heard of. And here it is shown on the map from 1894. I thought to myself, that looks somewhat familiar. So if we just show the Bewley House maze, well, Hampton Court is larger, and it's 68 metres long, as opposed to the Bewley House is 43 metres. But clearly, the design is the same. The maze design itself is essentially identical. So Bewley House maze is a copy of the Hampton Court maze. Just for comparison, we have a look at how it is depicted now. So we see on the left-hand side the OS master map for Hampton Court, and there we see it in all its lovely detail. Well, the cartography obviously is different. It's depicted differently. I assume because it's traced now from the aerial photograph in order to get the maze layout. So Hampton Court was easy to find, but how was I going to find other mazes on OS maps? And to my rescue came this thing, the GB1900 Project. This project ran from September 2016 to January 2018, and it was a collaboration between the Great Britain Historical GIS Project, which is based in the University of Portsmouth, and they are the creators of a Vision of Britain Through Time website. So it's a collaboration between them and various other partners, including the National Library of Scotland, the Royal Commission on the Ancient and Historical Monuments of Wales, and one or two others. So the GB1900 project computerised all the place names and other text that's found on the second edition county series 6-inch to 1 mile maps covering the whole of Great Britain. And they were published by the Ordnance Survey between 1888 and 1914. They call it 1900 for short. And through this project, I was able to download their gazetteer. So it gave me a whacking great big spreadsheet, which I remember certainly challenged the computer I was using at the time, because it had over 2.5 million records on it. So it's quite an impressive thing. Thankfully, I was able to filter it just to look for occurrences of the word maze within the gazetteer, and that reduced it to just 83 records. So you can see here just some of that filtered list. Some of the results are erroneous, so you might find the word maze within another word, such as Glenmazarin Lodge in Scotland at the top there. There's a Maze Green Road, which doesn't sound terribly promising, but many of the others looked like direct hits for actual mazes. So you can see on the right hand side, usefully also recorded are the grid references for those locations. So I didn't do anything clever at all. I simply went into the Digimap service that I have access to at work. So here's an example at the top of a maze in North Dorset. I took those national grid references, entered them into Digimap, and hey presto, up came a map image with a maze shown on it. And hey presto, it's another copy of the Hampton Court maze, yet again. So I wanted to keep a simple record of the mazes I found. So as well as recording the location and a specific map sheet they could be found on, I also wanted to capture a thumbnail image of the maze on the map. And I could have used a Digimap for this, but decided where possible to use the excellent collection of scanned 25-inch maps maintained by the National Library of Scotland. So I just captured those, little image of those, and where each one was located. And I found that there appeared to be Hampton Court mazes all over the place. I found plenty of examples of them. So here are 5 of them, all clearly sort of based on that same Hampton Court shape, although the maze inside differs with each one. The 4th one from the right isn't well depicted, I would say. That certainly doesn't work as a maze, whereas I think all the other ones do. So that kind of raised questions in my mind as to how these were surveyed in the first place, and so if anyone out there can answer that question, I'd be really interested to know how they were sort of recorded in the field, whether they just sketched or how was it done. But they didn't all show internal detail. There were plenty also that would just show the maze as an outline and just a blank space in the middle for whatever reason that might have been. So I found many of these that looked like the Hampton Court maze, but they weren't all like that. And there were mazes of many different kinds of shapes and designs that I discovered. So we had rectangular ones and square ones and lovely circular ones. So yeah, a wide range of different designs, which I just found fascinating to discover. The one shown top right caught my attention because of its interesting spiral design in the middle, which looked rather unusual. And I think pretty much by chance I stumbled upon this design. This is a plate from a book called The Theory and Practice of Gardening by John James from 1712. And in his book he describes a design for a maze, and there's a very clear similarity between his design and the one that I found on the map there. I just found that interesting. So yeah, let's just have a look then at how some maps are depicted on both contemporary and historic maps. So let's just take ourselves back to Saffron Walden that we looked at earlier. And on the modern OS master map, detail isn't shown in this case. It's you just get an outline of the maze, but that hasn't always been the case. Historically, the 1 to 500 map from 1877 is mapped in quite considerable detail and does show all the turf banks for that maze. Here's another example. This is Brent Lodge Park at Hanwell in London. Clearly a rather lovely hedge maze there on the air photograph, but again not shown in detail on the master map, just an outline. And I'm not criticising the OS in any way. There's simply observations that sometimes it's shown detail and sometimes it doesn't, and I don't know the reason for that. I was also having a look at how scale might affect the way mazes were shown. This is Escott Gardens at Ottery St Mary, and there is a maze there in the middle, not shown on the small scale map, just shown in outline. As we zoom in, I think it's the 10th map, just labels it as a maze, and just labels a maze again on the master map version, but no detail shown. And for comparison, this is Hever Castle in Kent. Again, there is a maze in the centre there, which is shown in detail on the 1 to 10th depiction. And there we are from the master map. Yeah, you see the hedge maze in all its glory there. So it's inconsistent the way they are depicted. This is Chatsworth House. So this is originally the site for Paxton's Great Conservatory. This was eventually demolished, and a maze was created there. This is shown on the map from 1970, and it's just another example that shows how the map is shown. So the maze is shown on the historic map as well as the current master map. An article written for Country Life magazine in 1903 describes how the vogue for mazes as a garden embellishment was on the wane by the mid-18th century, and no new mazes seem to have been made in England until one was planted in 1846 at this location, Somerleyton House, which is near Lowestoft. And it's said to be one of the finest yew hedge mazes in Britain, and it's another example of a maze being clearly represented on both the historic map, 1884 on the left, and on the current master map. And here's one I missed in my initial research, and I'm embarrassed to have missed it because it's virtually on my doorstep. This is the unusual square turf maze, which is on the summit of St Catherine's Hill at Winchester, and it's known as the Miz Maze, and it's set within the ramparts of an Iron Age hill fort. And here it is shown on the modern mapping. So this is a turf maze which is mapped in detail on the master map shown on the right. I couldn't resist talking about mazes without showing a personal favourite, and one that I have explored in person. This is called Glendurgan Garden, which is in Cornwall, and it's got a most beautiful hedge maze there, not shown in detail on the master map. Definitely worth a visit if you are in Cornwall. Don't make the mistake I did. Do make sure you've made a trip to the loo before you venture into this thing, because I was panicking at one point, I tell you. But it's a beautiful thing. And we return now to Cerdroia, the Cornish hedge maze that we saw earlier, and a drawing of the labyrinth that I found on their planning application. And we've seen how many mazes have been mapped in lovely detail on historic 25-inch maps on the OS, but perhaps less consistently shown on current mapping. And I just think it'd be nice if this labyrinth, once completed, and I think they're aiming to complete it this year if they get all the sponsorship that they need. It'd be great if it could be shown in detail on the picnic site at Colliford Lake on the modern map. And finally, we return to Adrian Fisher's front gate. Now, I've taken inspiration for this. The last couple of months we've had the builders in. They've been doing a refurbishment of the front of our house. So my front hedge is gone. The front wall has been rebuilt. And in fact, tomorrow, actually, the Iron Man, as the builders describe him, is coming with all the prototype parts for a new railing and a new gate that I'm having installed at the front of our house. But I'm not a maze designer. I am a map librarian, so I'm not having a maze. I'm going to have a map gate installed at the front of a house, and that's what it's going to look like. Yeah, so that's it. That's all I have to say about mazes and maps. Thank you very much for listening, and if you've got any questions at all, yeah, stick them in the chat, and I'll do my best to answer them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David, for that. It's been an amazing talk. So yes, no, thank you very much again. And if we'll just move on to, as David said, the Q&A session. So if anyone has any questions, please put your questions in the chat. This can be found in the bottom corner of the screen. So if you start putting your questions in, we'll happily work our way through them and see where we get to.
Well, glad you like the Mapgate idea, Judith. Yeah. I should start a consultancy, sort of Mapgate's business. Perhaps you'll see me on Dragon's Den or something later on.
Okay, right. So we've got our first question is it true that you place one hand on the wall of a maze and keep walking, maintaining contact between your hand and the wall, you eventually get out?
Yes, good question. Thank you for that, Christopher. Oh, it's almost as if we planted that one. Yeah. Yeah, it is true up to a point. I mean, there are techniques for escaping from mazes, but you first need to be sure what kind of maze it is really. And most methods work with simple mazes. So assuming that it is a simple maze, yeah, you can use this technique, which I think is called wall following. So essentially you just place one hand on the wall of a maze, and you maintain contact between your hand and the wall, and eventually you will get out. But some mazes are deliberately designed to frustrate you. So I think earlier on I showed you the one at Escott Gardens, which is a beach hedge maze in Devon. And that contains something like 5 bridges. And when you get features like that, or sort of mazes within a maze, that messes up that method. But I've just a few days ago, I don't know if any of you look at the thing called The Conversation. I found an article in there about how to escape a maze according to maths. And it does describe an algorithm which apparently works in all cases. And you imagine leaving a trail of breadcrumbs. So yeah, it describes it thus. If you arrive at a junction you have not previously encountered, there will be no crumbs on the trail ahead. Then randomly select a way to go. If that leads you to a junction where one path is new to you but the other is not, then you select the unexplored path. And if choosing between a once and twice used path, choose the path used once, then leave a new second trail behind you. The cardinal rule is never ever select a path already containing 2 trails. And this method, it says, is guaranteed eventually to get you out of any maze. So, so yeah, remember that. When you get trapped in a maze, yeah, bear that in mind. Take some breadcrumbs with you.
Okay, good advice there. So another question. So it's what a great bit of research, David. Do you know if the OS ever put any deliberate mistakes in the detailed maze mapping? Surely they don't want to make it too easy for anyone with a map.
Well, that's a good question. I don't know. Well, the Hampton Court maze is correct, and you can follow it with your finger, and that all works. As for any of the other mazes shown on the maps, I don't know. I haven't all traced them with my finger, so. There's a good lock. That would have been a good lockdown exercise to do, wouldn't it? Trying those out. So I don't know. Who knows? So go and find some mazes and try them out on the map.
So we'll hopefully find an answer from someone there. Okay, right. Another question here. All the examples were from England, I think. Are there international examples on maps?
Well, there might be. I'm afraid I've absolutely no idea. Yeah, they're all from, certainly Great Britain, but most from England, yeah, because I could easily access the large-scale mapping, both the modern mapping and the historic, via the Digimap service and through the National Library of Scotland. So it was just easy to do that. And you kind of really need access to the large-scale maps in order to be able to see the mazes in any detail. So I simply don't have access to that for other international examples. So that would be really interesting to know. So if anyone does come across any examples of mazes shown internationally, be good to know. Although I think of them as a very sort of British thing, although having said that, Adrian Fisher I was describing has created mazes all over the world, not just here in England. So they are certainly an international phenomenon.
So probably something else to look at going forward, maybe.
Yes, yeah. I can see this research going on now. Yeah.
Okay. Yes. So here's a question or a comment. It's David. You wondered about how they were surveyed. I heard that several land surveyors of the time who were sent in to survey mazes are still unaccounted for.
Yes, ha, Mick. Yeah.
Yep. I was thinking the joke myself about telling people to get lost.
But if anyone does know how it was done, I mean, I don't know the techniques that were used for surveying that sort of detail. I can imagine them measuring the outline of these things, and presumably the internal detail, was that just done with a sketchbook? And roughly, I don't know.
Okay, well, here's another question. Another comment on maps. So it's on mazes. It's I live in Corberton, Cambridgeshire. Sorry if I mangled the name. Which had an ancient maze until 1930. It was replicated in the grounds of the primary school for the millennium, but that too is now disappearing.
All right. Oh, that's interesting. That Combatant doesn't ring a bell, so that sounds like one that I hadn't traced when looking at the historical mapping. So yeah, I'll have to go back and see if I can find one at Combatant.
Yeah,
that's interesting. Yeah, it was recreated in the school. Yeah.
So there should be something in some of the aerial imagery, at least in the area.
Yeah.
Okay. So of the ones you have found on the old OS maps, how many are still there?
Not many. Many have gone. Of the sort of 70 or 80, I think I listed. Oh, I don't know. I didn't count up how many. I did record how many are still extant, but I can't remember what the figure is. But a large number have gone. I suppose mainly because, I mean, hedges are. You have to be pretty posh, don't you, to have a hedge? That you need a gardener. They're very, very expensive things to maintain, and so I suppose when money is tight, that might be one of the first things to go. I don't know. So yeah, many have disappeared. So the only record of them is in the maps.
Mm-hmm. Right, and here another observation maybe on this one. It's do you think the Hampton Court design was an accurate depiction of the many examples as they were seen on the ground, or is it possible it was used as a default symbol for a maze by the surveyors?
Well, they're all slightly different. So I don't think there was a sort of a Hampton Court maze stamp that was made, and they just sort of plonk that wherever they found a maze. So they all differ subtly. None of them are identical. So yeah, so I don't think it was copied, exactly in that way. Yeah, they're all individually drawn as far as I can tell.
Okay, right. Here's an interesting one. It's from Claire. What is it about this part of the world and mazes? Adrian Fisher is from here. You're from Portsmouth Uni, and Claire's cousin is a maze designer.
Ah.
He's also in the area. Is Southern Hampshire an amazing area?
Well, obviously, Southern Hampshire is an amazing area, and yeah, if you don't know it, come and visit. It's absolutely fantastic. So Christopher can vouch for that as well, because he lives just up the road, don't you, Christopher, in Fareham? So
yes,
yeah.
haven't actually visited any of the mazes in the region. I'll have to say that much.
Yeah.
There seems to be quite a lot.
But while we are a hotbed of maze design, I don't know. Adrian Fisher doesn't live in this neck of the woods anymore. I think he lives in a house, Devon, or Dorset, Devon, I think, something like that. So he doesn't live in Southsea anymore. But the gates remain as a reminder of his existence here. Yeah. So I hope my map gate will remain as a reminder that a map librarian once lived here. Yeah.
Yes. Oh, well, so I have to say it's been a great talk, and we've had a great response from everyone. And I think everyone's thoroughly enjoyed your observations of how mazes have appeared on maps. And it's just interesting that the real variation we get from either very fine detail to vague shape, which
yeah, they are fascinating things. They fascinate me. I don't think anyone has ever sort of looked into it particularly before. I haven't found anyone writing about mazes on maps. So yeah, it's an interesting little subject, and I hope you all found it interesting.
Okay, so I have to say thank you very much to everyone for joining us today. I want to thank David once again for the talk, which has been quite enlightening, and I'm sure we'll look at the mazes quite differently and see how they, and probably want to look up them up on the map on OS maps after we get back from them.
Yeah.
So I want to say we will look forward to seeing everyone else in the future, and we hope you join us for our future talks. And thank you and goodbye.